Hey, welcome back, or if this is your first time here, welcome in, pull up a chair. I'm glad you're here. There's a particular kind of silence that happens right after someone says something true by accident. Not a lie caught mid-sentence. Those get walked back fast, spun, buried under a follow-up soundbite by lunchtime. I mean, the other kind. The moment where someone says exactly what they mean, in exactly the words they'd use if no one was filming, and then you can watch, in real time, the realization land on their face that the cameras were, in fact, rolling the whole time. That happened twice in the same building, within about 20 minutes of each other, this past week in Las Vegas. And normally I'd say two unrelated slip-ups sharing a stage is just bad luck. But these two weren't unrelated. They were, if you squint even a little, the same story told twice. Once by a crowd, and once by a governor. And by the end of this video, I think you'll agree that neither one was actually about Las Vegas at all. So let's start with the crowd, because that's the one that's already ricocheted across the internet by the time you're watching this. Wednesday, Red Rock Resort, just outside the Las Vegas Strip. Before Donald Trump takes the stage, Nevada's Republican governor, Joe Lombardo, comes out to warm up the room. And part of that warm-up is honoring a police officer named Austin Abdelnabi, who had been killed 2 days earlier. 30 years old, a Marine Corps veteran. Grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, studied criminal justice at Clemson, joined the Las Vegas Metro Police Department in late 2023. On the Tuesday before the rally, he responded to a call about a man waving a gun near a business in East Las Vegas. According to the sheriff, the suspect ambushed him the moment he got out of his patrol vehicle. Abdelnabi was rushed to the hospital and died of his injuries. He left behind a wife, 2 brothers, a sister, parents. His mother told the Las Vegas Review-Journal that he gave selflessly to his job, that he liked working with the homeless population, that he wanted to make a difference. That's the man Lombardo stood up to honor. And here's what actually happened when he tried to. Lombardo starts to speak. He gets about one sentence in. So I know Pastor Tay spoke about Officer Abdelnabi a few moments ago. And before he can even finish the sentence, part of the crowd starts booing, not scattered, confused murmuring. An audible boo, loud enough that Lombardo visibly stops, looks concerned, and has to address it directly. He shakes his head. No, we're not booing him, he says, and then explains gently that this is a man who died protecting the same community these people are standing in. He asks for a moment of silence. The crowd, to its credit, gives him one. Now, I want to be careful here, because the honest, responsible answer to why did they boo is we don't fully know, and anyone telling you with total certainty they know what was in a stranger's head is selling you something. What we do know is the timing. The boo comes immediately after the name is said, not after any statement, any policy position, any controversial claim. Just the name, Abdelnabi, and several journalists covering this, including reporters at the Nevada Independent, pointed to something that had happened the exact same week, one state over. In Michigan, a Democratic Senate candidate named Abdul El Sayed had just won his primary, and in the hours after that win, a wave of attacks focused specifically on his name and his faith rolled through the same online spaces this crowd, statistically, spends a lot of time in. Could be coincidence. Could be a name that simply sounded unfamiliar in a room primed, for entirely separate reasons, to treat unfamiliar as suspicious. I genuinely don't know which. What I do know is that this isn't the first time this exact shape of moment has happened at a political event in this country, and it probably won't be the last. And that pattern, a pattern, not a single data point, is the part actually worth sitting with. Here's the thing about a reflex, which I think is the more useful word than racism or bigotry. Even though those words aren't wrong either, reflex is more precise because a reflex doesn't require thought. That's the entire definition of a reflex. A crowd trained over years to treat certain rally moments as booing cues doesn't necessarily stop. To process what's actually being said before the sound comes out. That's not a defense. If anything, it's worse in a specific way, because it means the target almost doesn't matter anymore. The behavior has become detached from any actual belief about the specific person in front of them. It's just what the room does now, at that particular emotional temperature, when that particular kind of name gets said in that particular tone of voice. Lombardo himself seemed to sense this in real time. He didn't get angry at the crowd, he corrected them, gently, like you'd correct a kid who says something at the dinner table without understanding what it means yet, which, in its own way, is the most damning read on what just happened. Now, normally that's where the story would end. Awkward moment, quick correction, moment of silence, everyone moves on, cable news runs it for a day and a half. Except this time, the same rally, the same afternoon, gave us moment number 2, and it's the one I actually think matters more, because unlike the boo, this one wasn't a crowd reflex. It was a sentence a sitting governor chose on purpose, in full command of his faculties, to say into a working microphone. Later in his remarks, Lombardo turns to a familiar line of criticism, the idea that Trump's economic agenda mostly benefits extremely wealthy people. Lombardo doesn't dispute it. That's the part worth pausing on. He doesn't dispute it, he agrees with it, and then explains why he thinks that's actually a good thing. Here's what he said, and I'm quoting this directly, because paraphrasing it would do it a disservice. When the press and media runs him down, they think about, he's taking care of his billionaire friends, but those billionaire friends provide jobs, and unless you take care of them, those jobs are absent. Read that again. Not, that's an unfair characterization. Not, let me explain what the policy actually does for working families. The defense, the entire defense, is, yes, and that's fine, because rich people need to be taken care of, or they'll stop providing jobs, presumably as some kind of act of spite. That's not spin. That's the trickle-down argument stripped all the way down to its studs, said out loud in public by an elected official standing next to the President of the United States, in a state where and I want you to sit with this fact for a second. The cost of groceries, gas, housing, and healthcare has been climbing hard enough that Lombardo's own Democratic opponent, Attorney General Aaron Ford, is currently building an entire re-election campaign around exactly this quote. Because here's the political problem, and it's a genuinely fascinating one if you like watching unforced errors happen in real time. Nevada is not a safe state for either party. It is, according to multiple outlets, the only state in the country to have voted for George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump, all 5 across 5 different elections. No consistent lean either direction. Lombardo is a first-term Republican governor up for re-election this November. In a state with 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic legislative majority, running against an attorney general who has already made cost of living the entire spine of his campaign. And into that exact environment, at the exact moment his opponent needed one clean, quotable piece of evidence that the sitting governor is more focused on the ultra-wealthy than on ordinary Nevadans, Lombardo just handed it to him, free of charge, on tape. Standing next to Trump, no less, which means the quote does double duty, tying both men to the same sentence in the same news cycle. And the numbers underneath that sentence are not abstract. Nevada's tourism economy, which is functionally the entire Nevada economy, has been absorbing real damage. The state's own political reporting describes a Trump slump tied to tariffs, immigration enforcement, and rising prices scaring off exactly the visitors Las Vegas depends on: Canadian tourists, Mexican tourists, Southern California day trippers, international travelers generally. That's consistent, by the way, with something we covered in this show's very first episode, the sharp, measurable collapse in cross-border travel between Canada and the U.S. over the past year. This isn't a new isolated data point. It's the same pattern showing up again, this time with a Nevada casino floor as the backdrop instead of an airport departure board. Meanwhile, food and grocery costs rose sharply over the past year, according to federal inflation data. Healthcare and utility costs are climbing, and this is the detail I actually find the most quietly infuriating. Earlier the same week, Lombardo, when directly asked what he could do about the affordability crisis in his own state, said, on the record, that he essentially couldn't control it, which makes the billionaire line land even stranger. He can't control the cost of eggs, but he's confident that the solution to a job shortfall is making sure the wealthiest people in the state are, in his words, taken care of. Now, I want to zoom out because I think it's tempting to treat these as two separate stories that happen to occur in the same room, an ugly crowd moment and a clumsy political gaffe, and file them under two different categories in your head. I don't think that's quite right. I think they're the same story, and here's why. Both moments are, in their own way, about who a political movement has decided deserves the benefit of the doubt, and who doesn't. A fallen officer, whose name sounded unfamiliar to some ears, didn't get it for about 4 seconds until a visibly uncomfortable governor forced the room to reconsider. Extremely wealthy political donors, whose names are entirely familiar, get it automatically, reflexively, articulated as settled economic doctrine rather than a debatable claim, even by officials whose own constituents are visibly struggling under the weight of that doctrine. One group gets an instinctive boo before the sentence about them is even finished. The other gets a defense before anyone's even finished the criticism. That's not a coincidence of scheduling. That's what a governing coalition's actual priorities sound like when the Polish comes off for 30 seconds, which, and this is the part that should worry people regardless of party, happens to almost everyone eventually, because nobody performs perfect message discipline for an entire term in office. The unscripted moments are usually the most honest ones. That's exactly why they're unscripted. There's also the broader pattern worth naming plainly, because I don't think it's an accident that this crowd's reflex and this governor's economic framing both point toward the same underlying assumption, that some people in this country are presumed to belong, contribute, and deserve protection by default, and others have to actively prove it 4 seconds at a time, name by name, before a room decides they're allowed the same basic decency. When that assumption shows up in a crowd, we call it prejudice, and it deserves that name. When the exact same assumption shows up in economic policy, the presumption that capital deserves protection as a first principle and that everyone else's needs are a secondary, negotiable concern to be addressed, unless the wealthy are taken care of first. We tend to call that something more clinical, like trickle-down economics, or supply-side theory, as if the underlying instinct isn't recognizably the same one. I'd argue it is. Not identical in severity, booing a dead man's name and defending a tax policy are not morally equivalent acts, and I'm not saying they are. But structurally, as reflexes, as instincts about who automatically counts and who has to earn it, they rhyme. Uncomfortably. So, what actually changes because of any of this? Probably in the short term, very little. Lombardo will likely try to walk the quote back, or reframe it, or simply let the next news cycle bury it, which is usually the more reliable strategy in politics than actually correcting course. Trump himself, notably, did address the officer's death directly and respectfully in his own remarks. He called Abdelnabi a hero, said he'd never be forgotten, thanked law enforcement broadly. That's worth including because fairness requires it, and because it makes the crowd's reflex even harder to explain away, as somehow coming from the top of that stage rather than from inside the room itself. The rally will fade from the news cycle within a week, the way these things always do. But the November election in Nevada is going to be a genuinely close one, in a state that has picked the winner of every single presidential race for 2 decades. And Aaron Ford's entire campaign strategy now has a gift-wrapped quote sitting at its center. One where a sitting governor didn't get caught saying something damaging, but voluntarily explained, in complete sentences, why he thinks it's correct. There's a difference between a slip of the tongue and a philosophy stated out loud by accident, and I think what happened in that room was closer to the second thing. Here's what I keep coming back to, though. A moment of silence, technically, did happen for Officer Abdelnabi that day. Lombardo made sure of it, and give him real credit for that. He handled the correction itself with genuine grace under pressure. But the 4 seconds before that silence tell you something the silence itself can't undo. And I think that's true of quite a lot of what happened in that room. The billionaire line got its own kind of moment of silence too, in a sense. A beat where nobody in that crowd audibly disagreed, where the defense of "we have to take care of them" landed, and the applause came right on cue, same as it always does. Whether that particular silence gets challenged the way the first one did, whether Nevada voters treat "we have to take care of the billionaires" the same way that crowd, eventually, treated the boo, That's the actual open question this state is going to answer in November, not with a moment of silence, with a ballot. I'm Marcus Fenn. This has been Borderlines, Analysis from the Edge. If you think this kind of detail is worth having, the channel's just getting started, and I genuinely appreciate you sticking around for the next one.